Right. Hi, Christy. Thank you very much for agreeing to see us today. It's an honor having you here. How are you feeling?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and it's great to have a conversation with you.
No, it's our pleasure completely. So I've invited you because you wrote this excellent book called The Beekeeper of Aleppo. We have recently published it in Bulgaria. Here's the cover, which
I love the cover. It's beautiful. I love the fact that you're the only publishers that have used a key in the cover, which is really symbolic in the story. I love it.
It is really symbolic, and I hope that our listeners and viewers will get to read the book, or maybe they already have and they will recognize the scene straight away. Shout out to our designers for the key. Yeah. And yeah, it's a fascinating story, and as you know, I have a very deeply personal connection with the story and with yourself because it was my debut translation.
Sure.
You set me on the road to translate literature, and since then I've already completed 3 other novels.
Wow.
So I feel very thankful for your involvement in my life.
Oh.
So this was a bit long-winded, but welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me.
I suppose the best way to start off is just for you to tell us how the whole idea came about, who you are and how this story resonates with you as a person.
Okay, that's going to be a long answer. So,
hey, no hurry.
Okay, so basically, I think the concept of displacement and the idea of what refugees go through, the trauma, the loss that they feel, the difficulty in finding a place of safety and security. I think these were themes and ideas that always really, really resonated with me because my parents were also refugees. So my parents became refugees after the war in Cyprus in 1974, and my dad was a commanding officer of that war. So he actually suffered a lot of trauma after that war. I mean, so did my mum, but because my dad was an officer, it was obviously more traumatic in various different ways for him. And so my mum and dad met in the UK. My dad managed to get to the UK right at the end of the war by traveling through Europe, and as he says, like eating fruit off the trees in France for him to survive. So they both made like really difficult journeys and then had to find a way once they got here of finding a way to feel secure and safe and integrating themselves into this new society. So when I was born, that was all very much part of my life. The interesting thing is that I didn't hear stories about the war. My parents became silent about the war, as did many of my other relatives. But the war and the shadow of it sort of lived on in my life. And I recently, actually, about a year ago, maybe a bit longer than that, when Beekeeper came out in the UK, I wrote an article about transgenerational trauma and how trauma can go from like one generation to another, particularly when people don't talk about the trauma. So it's actually more likely to pass on to the next generation when you're not discussing it than when you are discussing it, because then it passes through to the next generation in like actions that don't seem to have an explanation, in reactions that don't seem to have a something that you can sort of hold on to and understand. So I mean, the article's available if anyone wanted to read it on Google. I wrote it for The Observer. And I knew quite a lot about this stuff because I also studied psychoanalysis at some point in my life. So there were all these things. And so anyway, after my mum passed away, my dad moved back to Cyprus, and I went to visit him. I mean, I was visiting him loads, but I remember it was the spring of 2016, and the war in Syria at that point was absolutely horrendous. And my dad lives on like the east side of Cyprus that faces Syria. So I remember sitting on that sea, on the shore, facing the sea, and looking out across the water and thinking, Syria is across there and there's a war going on there. And like, I'm here and I'm safe, and you know, I can't, like, I just couldn't, I can take myself back right to that moment where I kept imagining what was going on there. Children must have been dying, bombs must have been falling, people must have been afraid. And because I knew what my parents had gone through, I sort of thought to myself, well, I wonder if at some point in history, the people in Syria were sitting, looking over at Cyprus and going, oh my gosh, people must be so frightened there. So all those thoughts and feelings made me want to do something to help. And I couldn't go to Syria, obviously, because it was, you know, it would be like suicide. So I thought, well, I speak Greek. I can go to Greece. So I ended up in Athens working in a refugee centre and for women and children. And it was that experience of working in the refugee centre that led to my desire to start writing. I didn't even know it was going to be a novel to begin with. I just was so overwhelmed with emotion of what I was seeing. And because since I was a little girl, if I've ever been overwhelmed with anything, my way of dealing with it is just to write something. So that's really what happened, and how I began writing the story.
Right, and you mentioned that cross-generational trauma that passes from one generation to the next. And you have another excellent book called Watermelon, the Fish, and the Bible, which hasn't been brought out in Bulgaria yet, so our readers wouldn't be familiar with it, or the majority of them anyway. But it does talk about the war in Syria, doesn't in Cyprus, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so would you say that you yourself have had some trauma passed on to you?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. 100%. In fact, when I was really young, I used to have this fear. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and think that a bomb was falling and run to the window and then open the curtains. I remember I had these pink velvet curtains that were like popular in the 80s, and I'd open the curtains and there's nothing there. It was just stars or a dark sky or clouds or something. And you know, I'd go back to bed and fall asleep. And you know, it wasn't until years later when my dad eventually started telling me some of his memories about the war that I realized that maybe somehow in my dad's, because I always remember my dad as I was growing up, that he had this sort of personality where he acted as if something was going to happen at any moment. Something catastrophic was going to happen at any moment. And when you're a child, you don't question it. You think, something's going to happen. You know, so he walked around with a lot of anxiety without me knowing where that anxiety was coming from. Like I remember once, for example, he got on a fairground ride, and it was one of those teacup things. No, it wasn't a teacup thing. It was the other thing that kind of spins around. And he suddenly got up as if he was going to have a heart attack, and he acted like something terrible was happening. He went yellow, and the guy had to stop the ride because the guy that worked the ride thought he was having a heart attack. I'm convinced now that that was a response from some sort of trauma he had during the war, that it was some kind of not feeling in control. But as a child, I saw something catastrophic in a simple fairground ride. So can you see how that could kind of get passed down? And there's no explanation. So if the explanation had been, say, from my mum or my dad, look, your dad was in a war, he experienced a lot of things, so sometimes he gets extra frightened of things that aren't actually frightening, then maybe I would have been able to reason with it. But if there's no explanation, there's no reasoning, then it gets passed on as a trauma. So then the trauma in me was, oh my God, I thought my dad was going to die at that moment.
And I was going to say funny thing, it's not funny, but you know, the odd thing here is that you actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but you grew up in the UK, in London. So you were just about as safe as safest people anywhere.
Exactly, yeah. completely safe in terms of war. There wasn't going to be a war, and yet I was having this kind of panic attacks. And I think they were, I mean, I've had therapy and stuff, you know, just because I was interested in that stuff, and also because, you know, we all have issues and blah, blah, blah. But I learned a lot from the therapy I had, and I think it was linked. I really do. And the funny thing is, like, eventually when The Beekeeper came out, and I was writing the article about transgenerational trauma, I was writing the article and I decided to go for a walk and have a break from writing it. And just at that moment, my dad rang me and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing an article about transgenerational trauma." He said, "What does that mean?" And I told him. And as soon as I told him, he said, "Oh," he said to me, "Do you know, the reason I never spoke to you about the war was because I wanted to protect you from it." And then he told me that even now, 40 years later, a week doesn't go by where he doesn't think about the war. So imagine 40 years ago, like how much, you know, just over 40 years ago, how much he was thinking about, how much he was sort of, must have been drowning in it. So that conversation I had with him and the memories that came up then proved to me that it was always there, just as I imagined it was. That the war was always there. It was in our house, sort of thing, but it wasn't tangible. It was just, I could feel it because I had these weird fears and feelings, and, you know, but you can't quite catch it because it doesn't have a form. So that's how it felt for me growing up.
That must have been really difficult, I imagine.
I didn't realise at the time. I just thought, because obviously we all have our good and our bad in our childhood, don't we? And there was so much good as well. So I didn't realise. I just thought, I didn't know any difference. So I just thought, oh, that's life. That's how you're supposed to feel. I don't think it occurred to me that I was experiencing something specific or something, you know, when I saw my dad on that fairground ride reacting like that, I just thought, well, maybe dads react like that. But I remember feeling really frightened that he was going to die, and that stayed with me. So I guess, yeah, I didn't fully recognize the difficulty at the time. I just remember experiencing some fears and not knowing what they were, or what they, you know, not really understanding them.
And in that sense, you have done a fantastic job of conveying the feeling of helplessness, the feeling of trauma, the feeling of angst, and I suppose to an extent the war itself, because there are some scenes from Syria in the book. And I've spent a long time dealing with the text of the book.
Yeah.
But how much do you think a reader who hasn't lived through it will be able to grasp the magnitude of the war and the trauma?
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know. I mean, what I hope for the most, more than anything, is that people will be able to just walk in the shoes of my characters and feel something of what they are feeling. And I guess that's what I had to try and be able to do. At some point, I thought, well, if I'm having these fears, what must my parents have felt? And then at some point, when I went to do the volunteer and I saw those children and the mothers and the fathers that were waiting outside, you know, because it was a women and children's centre. So the dads would bring their wives, girlfriends, sisters, mothers, grandmothers to the centre with the children, and then wait outside and not leave. You know, as if they couldn't bear to be separated, because there'd been so much separation and loss and fear. And that really touched me. And I remember at times thinking, what do they feel? What might they be feeling? And the children, when they were coming into the centre, there was a play area for children. Some of the children that came in, at first they weren't able to play. They were quite frightened still. They were unsure. They wouldn't join the other children when they were playing. And then you saw slowly, some child would run up to the new child and offer him, I don't know, a bit of Lego or something, and come and play with us. And then that child would, you know, and then eventually after a few weeks, that child would be playing like a normal child again. And then you kind of feel this bit of relief, and then you wonder, what were they thinking? What were they feeling then? what were they feeling? What are they feeling now? Sometimes I ask myself, where are they now? What are they feeling right now? Like, while we are here having this conversation right now, where are they and what are they feeling? And I think it was those questions that I had in my mind, first about my parents and then about the people that I met when I was volunteering. Those questions helped me to try and connect with something. And I hope that the feelings that I tried to imagine and connect with are the feelings that I've managed to get across to my reader. So I think that's what I hope for. Whether the reader can actually connect with the magnitude of it, I don't know. I hope so. But I think for me, as long as my reader can walk in my character's shoes, then for me, I would feel like I've achieved. I feel like I've achieved something if I can know that, if you know what I mean, in a kind of way where I think, well, then I've achieved the thing that I've wanted to achieve.
It's a beautiful way of putting it, and I think that to a large extent, this is exactly the effect that you achieve with the book. Now, when we first met, when we had that lovely lunch in London, I told you one thing that kept going through my mind the entire time. A Bulgarian reader will be reading this book with a different set of eyes. Because unlike the UK, which is the destination, and it's geographically as far removed from Syria as possible here on the continent, Bulgaria, much like Greece, is the entrance point.
Sure.
So the feeling here for some people is definitely the feeling of confrontation, of your Nadim character, the conflict between, first of all, Bulgarians and refugees, and second of all, among refugees themselves. Now, I happen to live in Sofia, in the capital city. We do have a large refugee center here. There are a few more nearer the borders with Turkey and Greece. And the society in Bulgaria is very divided into, I don't know, liberals and conservatives probably, or I don't even know how to put it, but pro and against refugees. And I suppose by default, people who would read this book would be pro anyway. But I'm interested to hear your view and perhaps a message you have for people who are against in our context, because you spent time in Athens and it's not unlike our context here.
Well, the thing is, when I spoke to a lot of the locals in Athens, because once I started writing the book, the locals would say, "What are you doing?" You know, because I went back there the year after and I was writing, and people would want to know what I was writing, and we would talk, and I would tell them I was writing about refugees, and some people would naturally find an opportunity to start voicing their opinions. And the thing is, obviously, I was writing a novel about refugees and how refugees feel, and obviously being on the side of refugees. But then when I was listening to the arguments against, I made sure not to argue against those views. And I thought that was important, because people I felt when I was listening to what the locals were saying, I thought, well, this is how they feel, and they have the right to feel worried, to feel concerned, to feel, and I think what tends to happen is we say to people, you shouldn't be worried, you shouldn't be concerned, and you should just be a nice person. And I think then if we say those things, then it creates these splits and divides in our society, where we have people that are either absolutely for or absolutely against. Whereas I often found that when I was talking to the locals and I just listened, and I said, well, what is it that you're afraid of? Rather than saying, well, these people need help, I don't want to listen to this. What are you afraid of? Then I would listen to them, and then they might listen to me too. So I might say that's totally understandable. And I'd say to them, well, I'm writing about this character who's also afraid in such and such a way. And then there'd be a softening. So I'd get a bit of their opinion, and then they'd get a bit of my opinion. And I think this is what we need more in society, to listen to each other. So if someone is scared or against, let's listen. I think we have this thing in society where we're like, don't give these people a voice. And then people get angry and they're like, well, hold on a minute, but I have something to say. Well, no one's listening, so I'm gonna say it louder, or I'm gonna say it in a way that's more aggressive. So, and I found that situation happening in Greece, which is why I thought, well, let me experiment differently. Let me deal with this differently. Let me see what happens if I just listen. And I felt that when I just listened, people softened. And then I'd be able to say, well, I met this person yesterday who was really, really, really afraid. And they'd been through such and such and such a thing. And then you see the other person's face changing, and they're like, oh. And then, I remember this one man saying to me, so then what do we do? One man said to me, well, we don't even have jobs here. We don't have anything. We're already in a difficult situation now, and we have all these people on our streets. What do we do? And I was like, I don't know. I said, all I know is that there's lots of people that are afraid on this side and on that side. So I think for me, it's about hearing people. And that's what I always stress. For me, it's so important. Let's not make people feel stupid or horrible for having an opinion that seems to be different from ours. Let's try and listen, and then let's give our opinion, and hopefully, fingers crossed, the outcome will be a softening of something. That would be my hope. That doesn't always happen, but that would be my hope. I just feel that if we say, no, you're stupid, I'm not listening, then then we're putting a wall, and then there's no way of building that bridge. So I think when people ask me that question, I always say, let's try and build bridges rather than build walls, and see how we can do that, and think about how we can do that.
Funny you should say that, because there was an actual physical wall constructed on the Bulgarian border with Turkey, I believe, a couple of years back. Yeah, I think it was around the same time when Trump was building his wall.
Sure.
Yeah. And it was for specifically this reason, because there was a huge influx from refugees from Syria. And the other thing is, Bulgaria has historically had excellent diplomatic relationships with Syria, back in the 70s, 80s, somewhere around that time. And we do have a substantial Syrian minority in Bulgaria, which predates the war, at least the current war, by a long time. But still, there seems to be a division of opinions in this country.
Sure.
You yourself have never been in Syria, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I suppose this will kind of take us in two different directions. First of all, the book itself and the story of the book, the plot. But on the other hand, creative writing, because you are a lecturer in creative writing in Brunel. Am I correct? Yes. Yeah. Boom. I got that correct.
Yeah, good memory.
So you've never been in Syria, and when I started translating the book, and I must be on some watch list somewhere, because I started Googling plane tickets to Aleppo, which probably was not the best thing to do. But I seem to remember from one of your lectures that I've seen online, you were telling a story of how you came to grips with describing a place that you've never seen, you've never smelt, you've never heard. And this is interesting to me as a person who deals with text, but I suppose also to our readers. How do you paint a picture you've never seen? And that will bring us to your character, Afra, as well.
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. Now, when I first started writing the book, I didn't think of it because I didn't realize it was going to become a novel. I just I had this scene in my mind of this woman and a man, and the woman was blind and they'd lost their son, and the man was walking into their house and the house was crumbling. And I started by just writing that scene. And then the characters started coming to life, and then everything started coming to life. And then I realized I wanted to continue writing. And then I thought, well, how am I going to do this bit that's set in Syria? I have never been to Syria. And so I almost gave up. And so what happened was I thought, well, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I really, really couldn't. You know, sometimes you just can't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about the people I'd met, the opening scene that I'd written, these characters that started to come to life in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the war that was still happening there at the time. So I thought to myself, well, this is when I'd started writing. I thought, well, I tell you what, I said to myself, I'll go back to Greece the following year. And so because I knew I wanted to go back to Greece and volunteer again, I decided to have Arabic lessons. Now this is where the story deepens, because I coincidentally happened to find an Arabic tutor who was from Aleppo and who was a refugee. So what I ended up doing with him was, so I'd have Arabic lessons with him. I'd do 45 minutes of Arabic. Well, at the beginning I was doing 1.5 hours of Arabic. But then when he realized that I'd written this scene and that I was writing things and he wanted to read it, then he started saying to me, well, don't stop writing, keep on writing. So I was like, I remember saying to him, well, I don't know how to write this bit in Syria. So what we did with the Syria bits, because I was reading part of my manuscript, it started to become a manuscript at that point. So we were doing 45 minutes of reading, doing Arabic, then 45 minutes of me reading the manuscript to him. And so when it came to those bits that are set in Syria, where Nuri and Afra have to go from Aleppo, for example, to the Turkish border, he opened up the map on Google. And I remember where we were as well. We were in this cafe in East Finchley, in North London. So he opened up the map on Google, and then he said, where are your characters? Where do you want them to be? And then we'd sort of make the journey by talking. And so which road are they going to go down? That road. What's this road called? What is there? What exists there? Or there's a clock tower. Or there's these kinds of trees. Or I'd say to him, well, and I'd use Cyprus as my basis, because don't forget, Cyprus and Syria are so close together that we even have dust storms from Syria. So you can smell in Cyprus, you can look up at the sky and see the desert storm coming towards you. And it's like a sort of soft purpley color. And you can smell it, you can smell the desert. It's a very specific feeling and a very specific smell. So that's something that's been familiar to me since I was young. Another thing is, like, I would say to Ibrahim, so in Cyprus we have lots of jasmine everywhere. So when it's hot, there's, you can smell jasmine or the lemon trees or this kind of thing. And a lot of the stuff was very similar, especially the closer you got to the Turkish border and the further you got away from the desert. So we kind of step by step made the journey with words. And I was able to ask any question I wanted. And I could see that it was difficult for Ibrahim because it was bringing back memories of a place that he couldn't return to at that time. And he also knew that if he did return one day, he didn't know what he was going to find. So it was a really emotional thing to do with him, but it helped me to develop that part of the story. I don't think I would have been able to do that part of the story without having these conversations with Ibrahim. So that's how that came about.
And without giving too much away about the book, Afra, she's, I feel that there's a parallel there because as you gave away a few minutes ago, she is blind. And as I gave away a few minutes earlier than that, she deals with painting. She's an artist. So I suppose the more specific question here is, did you base your characters on any specific people or on any specific feelings you had?
Not people. Well, I think Nora and Afra were fictional, but I think they were inspired by the wonderful people that I met. So I met, like, for example, I met this woman, but this particular woman wasn't from Syria, she was from Afghanistan, but she was using charcoal to draw sketches of her memories, both of Afghanistan and of her journey. And they were really beautiful, really haunting charcoal drawings. So that, seeing her and seeing her paintings gave me the idea for Afra to be an artist, for example. But that woman was from Afghanistan, and her paintings weren't about the landscape. They all had people in them. Whereas what Afra painted before she went blind was the landscape. So I think the people that I met inspired me, and they became like part of the characters that I created. The characters that I created were infused with memories of the people that I'd met, but they were all fictional creations. But it was also my feelings too. So I guess, I don't know if this is where you were going with it, but I never got to physically see Syria. I had to imagine what I was seeing through somebody else's descriptions. And interestingly, this is the first time, actually you've got me thinking this for the first time, Nouri has to explain to Afra what he sees in a similar way to Ibrahim having had to explain to me what he saw when he was there, or what he imagined. So I've never actually made that connection until right now speaking to you. So that's interesting.
I don't know, probably, I didn't want to lead you there, but this is very much what I had in mind. I'm glad that it worked out.
It resonates with me. I knew you were sort of going that way, and I was like, oh my God, he's got a really good point. I never thought of that. But absolutely, yeah.
Another thing that really struck me is, perhaps going back a few questions now, you haven't created this idealized version of a refugee, because you've got your main characters, Nura and Afra, who are positive characters and they kind of carry the whole meaning and the whole message of the book. But then they keep meeting those other refugees who are, to put it mildly, negative characters, who can be evil, who can be callous. And I think this is where you strike that balance that you were talking about, when you have to listen to the other person's point of view. And I'm again curious to know whether this is entirely fictional or whether this is something that you've witnessed.
Well, the thing is, it's not just the refugees who were able to be callous and in inverted commas evil in some way, because I never believe that anyone's just evil. But it was the locals as well. So when Afra and Nouri end up in Bedion Duareos, which is one of the refugee centres that existed in Athens, which was a park, basically, that had been made into a campsite, there were a lot of people there exploiting the vulnerable people and using the situation in a way to make money. And some of these people were Greek. And so, and some of these people were refugees themselves. So there was like, the second year that I went, not the first year, the second year that I went, when the locals started to speak to me, and I started discovering stories about child prostitution and how people were kidnapping children in order to, I know this is very horrific, but in order to take their organs, to sell them. When I first heard these stories, I didn't believe they were true. I didn't want to believe they were true, but then I verified them by reading. So I heard these stories from quite a few people, and then I thought, well, a few people are telling me the same thing. So I would read newspaper articles, Greek ones, English ones, I'd listen to the news, I'd try and kind of find sources that I thought were reliable sources to see if the information I was getting from people was supported by the sources that I thought were more reliable than word of mouth. And everything was actually confirmed, the things that I was hearing. Of course, when someone tells you a story that they've heard or that they've experienced, it's elaborated, and there might be some elaborations, but the core of it, the things that I was hoping weren't true, that I believed, oh, this cannot be true, actually were true. So in the story, I wanted to deal with this I tried to deal with it in a way that was as sensitive as possible. And as real as possible. So the characters that were involved in these very exploitative situations, like child prostitution and kidnapping and whatever, were not only refugees, there were also Greek locals. And the refugees that had become involved in it often became involved because, like the twins in the story, they were lured into it, and then there's no way out. So with Nadim, I have a character where, yes, he is encouraging boys to become prostitutes, but at the same time, he's cutting his own wrists because of the guilt that he feels. So although somebody might read the character of Nadim and say, well, he's evil, I would say maybe question, obviously, not all of us would end up being that kind of person in any situation. Some people would say absolutely no way. Some people don't. But does that mean they're evil? Or is there a different kind of weakness? And so I think I would hope that the reader would question what makes one person get into exploiting people in such a way, and another person say, no, I'm not going to go down that path. What is that line? So I don't think there's necessarily, oh, here's a good person, here's an evil. It's how do people get there, and what are the situations that force them to that place? And even Nuri commits something, and I don't want to give it away, but even Nuri does something that he wouldn't have otherwise done. So I put that situation to get people to see, well, maybe we can't divide things up into here's good on this side and here's evil on that side. And maybe it takes a bit more questioning and thinking about these things and wondering how is it that people end up in these places.
I think you've done a terrific job of presenting a very balanced view of these things, and I think this is perhaps the strongest point of this novel. We've talked about Nuri and Afra and Nadim, and by the way, this is just a trinket of information. Konstantinos Fotakis, you created a character by this name, and I found it very entertaining because one of the heroes of my hometown has exactly the same name, just the Bulgarian version.
Really?
So, yeah, I thought that was a sign from destiny. But one character you haven't mentioned, and I'm not going to ask a specific question, I would just like to hear you talk about Mohammed.
Oh, I can't. I don't know what to say. Every time someone says to me, talk about Mohammed, I can't talk about him, because if I do, I will give something away. I don't think there's anything I can say that won't give something away.
I respect that. And I don't think I can either.
So I think what I can say about Mohammed is I'd like to allow the reader to discover what Mohammed means themselves. But I can't say more than that.
I completely respect this decision, and I completely understand it as well.
Yeah.
Aside from Nuri and Afra and the whole Syrian crisis, you've got two important characters who come from different places, from respectively Morocco and the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire. I particularly like Diomande. I don't know why. I think he gives me the warmest feeling out of everyone else in the book. Who are they?
To be honest, I don't know. They're inspired by people I met along the way of writing this book, and people that I interviewed, and stories that I heard from people that had come from all over the world. And maybe I might have spoken to someone and thought, oh gosh, you know, I think Diomande is someone who had dreams, for example. And I met a lot of people who had dreams, who, you know, and the Moroccan man is someone who's sort of been almost like swept by the tide of the times. And I met a lot of people like that too. So I guess Diomande and the Moroccan man are accumulations of people that I met along the way, because I ended up interviewing so many people and talking to so many people, and not just from Syria, and especially in Greece, because there weren't just people from Syria there. There were people from everywhere. And like Angeliki, for example, who is also from Africa. And she had a different story, a different reason for being there. And a lot of people did. And of course, I wasn't telling their story. I was telling the story of Nouri and Afra. But these people also stayed in my mind, you know? So I think I met people like the Moroccan man and people like Diomande, and I felt warmth and affection towards them. And then that sort of came out in the story, I guess. And, you know, there's this thing with Diomande's, his wings. Again, I don't want to say too much about it, but I can't say too much, but he has these sort of wings that could be real or could be symbolic that Nouri sees when he looks at him.
The fact that we talk so much about characters in the book, I think, is an indication of how human the book is. It's very relatable, I would say, and I think that any reader with common sense and with critical thinking will be able to recognize themselves in each character at a different stage in their life. As you said, Nouri does something that he wouldn't ordinarily do because of the situation he's in, and I suppose that's the case with most characters. But I find there's another layer there, which is not so much human as human-made, and I think it's represented by Lucy Fisher. So aside from all those difficulties that you've described so eloquently in the book that a refugee might come across along the way, there's also, I don't like the word, but the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's that like?
Well, I suppose because I learnt a lot from Ibrahim about the system, you know, because he was a translator for boys who were having their asylum interviews. So I learned a lot about that process, and I also interviewed someone who was a boy who was having his asylum interview, or who was in the process, and how he had to remember the story very clearly and coherently so that he could relate it. And I heard a lot of things from Ibrahim about the kind of questions that are asked, and how sometimes the interviewers try and catch people out. So if there's a couple, they'll ask one person, tell me one thing about your son, for example, and then they'll ask the other person something related to that to see if it matches. So I learned a lot about this, the bureaucracy, the system, and Lucy Fisher in a way is like, she's not a bad person. She's a good person, she wants to help them, but she's restricted by the system. She's part of the system, and the system isn't necessarily, again, the word comes back, it's not necessarily evil, you know, because there are good people that are working within that system. But it's what are the restrictions? What are the, like, for example, there are awful bits as well, like the kind of questions that people are asked, the fact that it can become so insensitive And the fact that these questions are asked in a way where we stop, our paranoia overtakes the reality that a human being is sitting in front of us, and a human being that's probably been through a lot of trauma. So we put paranoia first. And you might see that in the questions, in the way that the interviews are conducted, in the lack of compassion, because the interviews are there to determine, well, who is genuine and who is not. And so in some way then we treat everyone as if it's like guilty until proven innocent sort of thing. So I guess there are so many problems in the system, but that you get good people in the system, just like Lucy Fisher. And so that's what I experienced when I was learning about it, and that's what I tried to convey through the narrative.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with how the system works in this country, but I've been involved in it in the UK very briefly. So I think you've summarized it really well, and I'm really curious now. Just in this conversation, I'm starting to get curious about how it works in this country as an entrance point rather than a destination.
I see, yeah.
And there's one more thing that we haven't touched on, which is really weird, the non-human bit. What about the bee? Yeah.
What about the bees? So I woke up one morning, so this is the fun bit to talk about, but also there's sadness with this too. So I basically just woke up one morning and thought, Nuri needs to be a beekeeper. That's what he needs to be. That's what he is. It's like, that's what he wants. I got so excited because it just fit with his character. And so I started researching beekeeping. I didn't know anything. So I had this idea, and I started to do all the research, and I learned so much about beekeeping. It was so interesting. But I still felt that I didn't know enough. And then as I was doing my research and doing looking at beekeeping in Syria, agriculture in Syria, the effects of the war on agriculture and that sort of thing, I came across an article about a man called Dr. Riyad al-Sus, who was a refugee from Damascus and came to the UK with his family and settled in the north of England in a place called Huddersfield, and set up a project called the Buzz Project, where basically he teaches refugees and job seekers how to keep bees. And in Damascus, he was a professor of agriculture and a beekeeper. So I contacted him via Facebook, the wonders of social media, and got a reply from him. And I said to him, in the message, I remember I said, I think what you're doing is wonderful. You seem like such an amazing person. And I said to him, I'd love to speak to you. And this is what I'm doing. And then he responded to me and he said, why don't we have and he said, what you're doing sounds wonderful. Why don't we have a talk on the phone? And then he invited me to go up there to meet the bees and his family and him. And so I went up there, and when I first met the bees, it was in his garden. So we didn't yet go to the apiaries. And so in his garden, he didn't have any protective gear, and he had about 5 beehives. And 5 beehives, there is a lot of bees with 5 beehives. So he said, there's no protective gear. Do you want to still go out and see the bees? And I said, yes, okay, even though I was a bit scared. And that whole scene where Mustafa goes and takes Nuri to meet the bees, and he stands there, and all the stuff that Mustafa says to him about keeping his hand like this and pretending to be as still as a tree, and the way that Nuri feels about smelling everything and the smell of the flowers and the honey and the sound of the bees, that's basically what I experienced standing there in Riyad's garden without any protective gear. And I felt so exposed, but it was such an amazingly scary and beautiful moment at the same time. So I used that directly, that actual experience I used when Nuri was meeting the bees for the first time. And then we went to the apiaries, And Riyadh was teaching me so much about the bees, like how he raises queen bees, how the bees communicate with one another through a dance, how they go in different directions to find food, and how they tell each other like which direction to go in, and all these wonderful and interesting things that I didn't quite absorb in the same way when I was reading. And plus it's so much different when you're actually there and someone's showing you. So I recorded all of this, and then remained friends with Riyadh, so I could ask him various questions along the way. And plus, from what I learned from him, it kind of inspired me to do even more research and read even more about bees and beekeeping. And I remember it was Riyadh that said to me, bees work together, you know, and in a way that humans don't. And that really stayed with me. So it was those experiences that I, you know, try and put in the novel. But then I also read articles about, during my research, about beehives that were vandalized and the effects that the war had on nature as well, on the countryside, on the trees, on the bees, on various, you know, because we think about the buildings and the people, and we forget sometimes about just the landscape. And so, yeah, that's where all that came into it. That's how all the beekeeping came into it.
You say you woke up one morning and just knew that he had to be a beekeeper because that fit with his character. How?
I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on what it was. It was like, I imagined him to be someone who needed to be outdoors and someone who had like a free spirit, and also somebody who was very caring and very methodical. So somehow I already imagined those things in his character. So somehow, although I didn't know much about beekeeping, it kind of like fit. It just slotted. It was like finding like two pieces of the jigsaw and going, that just fits with how I imagined him. It just works. I didn't have to sort of force it. I had this character in mind, and then I just woke up and thought, I don't know much about beekeeping, but I just imagined that this is going to slot together. This is a good fit with my character. It just somehow worked, and it did. And the more I researched, the more it fit with what I already had developed in Nuri's character. But it also helped me to develop his character more as well.
I can't disagree with that. It's the perfect profession for him.
Yeah.
But you know, it's just interesting to hear how you came to that realization.
Yeah.
So, the book has brought you tremendous success, hasn't it? You've traveled the world. I think when I was starting to translate it, this was, correct me if I'm wrong, the 19th country or the 19th language in which the book was coming out. Presumably there have been more since. How is that? How are you feeling about this?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think, really? Like, is that my book? Are you sure? Kind of thing, you know. So it's difficult to realize that I created that story, but at the same time, then I go back to my feelings when I was writing it, and I remember how I felt and how I felt working at the refugee centre and the stories that I heard. And when I reconnect with all those feelings, I think that I'm really pleased that so many people want to read it and want to learn more about refugees. And you know, you mentioned something earlier that you said mostly people that are pro-refugees would probably read this book. But actually, I've spoken to so many people that weren't, that actually say that not necessarily just my book helped them to change their mind, but that a series of things, whether it was something they saw on TV or something that they heard somewhere, and then also reading my book. So we shouldn't never underestimate the power that these things have. I think to never underestimate the power that stories in all their forms, whether it's a documentary, whether it's someone telling their story, or a novel like mine, or a memoir, or something else, can have, because it it elicits thinking and empathy, I think, all these things. So people that I've met weren't necessarily pro-refugees, but they were open to something. And I think that little bit of openness can then create more openness, because someone will read my book first and then read other things, or read something else first and then read my book. So I feel proud that I've been able to contribute to some people feeling differently about refugees. Really, really, like when I put myself back in that refugee centre where I worked, then that emotion becomes the most powerful one for me.
You work with books day in, day out, and you tell people how to write, and you give them feedback, and you construct characters, and you construct storylines and everything. So you have a very objective view of what makes a book successful. Did you expect that from your book? Did you think it had the potential to get there?
See, it's different when it's your own book. It's a bit like when somebody's like a therapist, for example, and needs to have their own therapy. And then someone says, well, why do you need to have your own therapy if you know all this? And it's different when it's your own mind. And I think it's also different when it's your own work. Like I can read somebody else's work and I can feel if it's got that sort of thing that's going to appeal to lots of people. Or I can, if I'm reading a student's work, I'm like, yeah, this is so beautiful, but something's holding it back. And I can kind of, feel that there's something, and sometimes I can put my finger on it and sometimes I can't. I think when it's your own stories, when you're writing, you're on your own, sometimes it's harder to see that because you're so involved, you're so invested in the characters. It can be such an emotional experience that it's not always easy to see that, which is why I always have a support system around me when I'm writing. So, and I always tell my students to make sure that they have it. So when I'm teaching the MA class, the good thing is they have it because they have their workshop group. So what I have is my writing group, which I didn't have for the first book, but I had for my next book that I've just finished writing. But what I did have was colleagues that I could send the story to. I had my agent that I could send my story to. And I knew that my agent, I would often say to her, I know I can relax and write because I know that if something's not working, you will tell me. And I think everybody needs that not just one person, but a group of people that can be there sort of workshopping. You need to be able to say to someone, look, I've done this. Is it working? Shall I carry on? Am I barking up the wrong tree here? I'm feeling something about this. What do you think? Does it affect you? Is it affecting? Is it, and I think it's very hard for me to figure those things out on my own. So I didn't know. I was just writing and people were saying, keep writing. So I kept writing. So that's basically how it happened.
No, I think that's excellent advice because now that I work at a publishing house, I do get to meet people and writers, prospective writers, and some of them are too full of themselves and they do not allow anyone to touch their work or say anything negative about it. Whereas I am kind of like you, I'm a team player and I like people criticizing me very fiercely.
I like criticism. Now, it sounds weird, but it's so productive, because it's the way to grow. It really is. And the other thing that I say to my students is like, how do you know which criticism to accept and which one to discard? So if you're getting like various people's opinions, what do you do with that? Like, how do you know what to, and I guess you have to trust yourself a little bit as well. So like, does something resonate with something you really felt a little bit but ignored? Or for example, does something, are two people or even three or even four people saying the same thing, you have to listen. if 20 people are saying the same thing to you and you're ignoring it, well, you know, that might not work out so well. So, you know, it's about learning how to listen and who to listen to and when to listen and how much to listen. So it may be that someone's saying something, but actually you don't have to take the whole thing that they're saying. It might well be one part of it that's relevant. So it's all these things. It's such a complicated thing to learn how to accept criticism and also how to give it as well. So it goes both ways, because you might then end up being part of somebody else's support group with their own novel. Then, you know, is your opinion the be all and end all of everything, or will your opinion be part of a group, you know, an array of opinions? So I think it's so important if you're a writer to not isolate yourself. So important.
Well, that's the whole point of being a writer. I mean, you are bringing this book out to society, so you need to listen to society and see what they've got to say about it. Do you have any other gems of wisdom for writers? What else is important?
Finish what you're writing. It's so important. It's like the most important thing, and most people don't finish what they're writing. Finish it, finish it. You know, because there's so many people that write wonderful things and they just have no belief in it, and so they stop writing, and it's never going to get published if it's not finished. That's a fact. That is an actual fact. If it's not finished, it won't get published.
Was it Michael Jordan who said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take?
Exactly. This is it. Yeah. If you don't finish it, you're absolutely ensuring that it's not going to get published. So that, you know, that's, for me, that's like the most important thing. Finish it. And then the workshopping and all of that, you know, can happen while you're on that journey to finishing it.
So you mentioned in passing that you have been working on another manuscript. Care to give away a little bit about it without jinxing it?
Okay, so I'm one of these people that really gets scared about jinxing things.
I'm not pressuring you into anything. If you're not comfortable, you don't have to. We can continue.
It's just funny that you said jinxing, because I'm always like, oh my God, shall I say that? Will I jinx it? And
I've spoken to enough writers by now to know that.
But with everything in my life, it's like a conversation I'm always having in my head. Like, even if I'm making a cake, I'm like, shall I look at it or will it jinx it? Is it going to make any difference? So anyway, yes, I can say a little bit about it. It's called Songbirds. And whereas The Beekeeper of Aleppo was about the refugee experience, this one is, in a very small nutshell, it's about migration and poaching. And it's set in Cyprus this time, and it's loosely inspired by a true story where 5 domestic workers and 2 children, all foreign, went missing, and nobody searched for them because they were foreign. So it was that was the starting point for the story. But it's also about poaching as well, and the one becomes a metaphor for the other. So I think that's about as much as I can say right now.
I'm very much looking forward to reading it, and hopefully we'll have it in our possession very soon as well. See, you mentioned now that no one searches for them because they're foreign. And I didn't allude to this earlier, but I think it's probably important to ask this because, you know, like yourself, I am somewhat British, I would say by now. And we have slightly different perspectives because I am first generation, as it were, immigrant, and you are second generation. How would you describe your experience as being somewhat foreign in your own country?
God, it's so hard because I'm a bit foreign here and I'm a bit foreign in Cyprus. So in Cyprus, well, I say it's so hard, but not in a kind of devastating way. But growing up, there were difficulties, you know, especially like, you know, I think when you get first generation immigrants, they often, like with my parents, especially because of the fact they were refugees, they often do this, almost like crabs going into their shell. They become frightened a little bit of the outside world out there that they don't know about yet. And so the children of those parents often end up in this kind of twilight zone. Hold on, my friends are all doing this, and the rest of society is all doing this, and my parents are saying this because they're somehow in their heads, they're back in the village or the town in Cyprus, and where do I belong and who am I? And so there's that. And then when I go to Cyprus, we're Cypriots that were born in London they call us Charlies, which comes from Prince Charles.
They could have selected any member of the royal family and they went for Prince Charles. That's telling.
Exactly. So we're all called Charles in some way. So it's like you can't win wherever you are. It's like you're in Cyprus and you're a Charlua. And if it's a boy, it's a Charlis, right? So I'm a Charlua and my brother is a Charlie.
Wow.
Right? So I've had that from the start of visiting Cyprus, from when I was really young. That's what we are. We just are that. That's what it is. So we don't quite belong there, and then you never ever quite belong.
Well, neither does Prince Charles. Don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but you know, it's like here, I feel British. I was born in Islington. I was born in St. Bart's Hospital in Islington. We lived on Old Street. Then we moved to Edmonton. I'm literally born and bred in London, but yet I feel like, do I really belong here or do I belong in Cyprus? And it's a question that I've always had in my mind. You know, But the good thing about London is so multicultural. You know, it's easy for everyone to sort of blend in, or easier. I don't want to say easy because, you know. And the other thing about Cyprus is that because Cyprus was a British colony, it was easier for Cypriot refugees to move to the UK than it might be for other refugees. So that was one thing that was easier for my parents than it might be for refugees from non-Commonwealth countries. So there's all these things to sort of take into consideration, but really, I mean, it's kind of weird, you know, there is always that thing in your life where you think, do I belong? Where do I belong? Where, you know, where is home? So I think that's always existed for me.
I was interested to hear what you say about this because a couple of months ago, I interviewed an author called Nick Bradley. He also teaches creative writing just in UEA,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And he's well-traveled. He's lived in Japan for a while. And though he's, you know, much more British than you and I in a way, he also kind of feels that he's not quite at home anywhere. And it is just dawning on me that it probably is some kind of backlash from the whole colonial past, because you mentioned the Cyprus as having been a colony to the empire. And none of us who are in the UK, and especially in London, are probably 100% British.
It's quite rare to meet someone who's 100% British. I mean, if I think about all my neighbours in my block, for example, there are 6 flats. Just as an example, there's only Shirley, who's 100% British. She's from Yorkshire. She's lovely. She's 85. She lives downstairs. Everyone else is not 100% British, everyone. So there's 6 flats in this block and there's only one person here that's 100% British.
Well, I didn't want to go there, but it kind of ushering me in that direction. Brexit.
Well, oh goodness me. I obviously didn't want it to happen, but it has. I don't know. To me, it just says so much about, those splits, those divides that we were talking about earlier on. I think it's a consequence of those sorts of things. Where people how is that going to affect refugees? What do you think? I don't know. It could affect refugees in so many ways, with people's opinions, like people feeling that their racist opinions in a way have been justified or confirmed, or in some way. And in another way, I don't know what's going to happen. To be honest, I really don't know the ins and outs of how it will affect refugees and migrants when it comes to border control. So that's concerning, but I don't know enough about it to be able to say, well, this will happen or this will happen.
Yeah, it's a mucky territory. We shouldn't go into it, probably.
Yeah.
We can cut it out. Can you tell us about this lovely frame behind you?
This one?
Yep.
Oh, so this, basically this is the Nielsen Bestseller Awards, and it's presented to authors for official sales over 500,000 copies in the UK.
500,000?
Yeah.
I think I sold about 500 and I was pleased with mine.
I know, I don't quite know what to do with that number in my head. Like, I keep thinking, God, that book that I sat down and wrote, the feelings that I had, and there might be somebody now reading the book that I wrote, and it's such a weird feeling. It's such a weird feeling.
Some time ago, I was having a completely different, irrelevant conversation on Zoom with someone. And there was a bookshelf behind her, like there is one behind me, just so I can look more sophisticated, obviously. But she had, like I have it here, she had your book at the back. And I said, wow, is that The Beekeeper of Aleppo? And she said, wow, good eyes, how did you recognize it? That explains I've been in touch with the book for a while. But yeah, I've seen people read it on the plane. I've seen it on every single airport. W.H. Smith's always just woos his beekeepers everywhere. Yeah.
Beekeepers.
Yeah.
But because of that, it's so frightening when a new book comes out, So I've got Songbirds coming out soon, and it's like, it's so scary because you think, oh God, that one did so well, what's going to happen? But I suppose each book has its own life in a way, and its own journey. I've just got to let go and let it happen, whatever's going to happen.
Well, whatever happens, you have achieved a tremendous success, and I don't just mean it in terms of numbers, because that's belittling to your work. I don't mean it in that way at all. It's great that the numbers are growing, but in terms of the content and in terms of your personal and human achievement, you've done wonders. And whether this be your opus or maybe you come up with something much better, I don't know. I hope you do. You have already done a great service to humanity, so thank you for this.
Oh, thank you. That's such a lovely thing to say. Like, really lovely thing to say.
No, I mean it when I do say it. Is there anything you would like to share with us, to tell us, anything that I didn't quite touch on, anything that you were hoping to say?
I think you've asked me like really, really, really amazing questions, ones where I could really expand, so I don't think so.
Thank you. I'm glad I did. I told you this a long time ago, and I'm echoing it now. we would very much love to have you over. Obviously, the situation now prevents it. But once things settle down, my colleagues and I would absolutely love to have you over.
I'd love to.
Some of them are in the next room, some of them have left for the day, but they have asked me to pass their best wishes to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's nice.
So yeah, we would very much love to have you over. We have great creative writing courses in Bulgaria where you could come and speak as well.
Sounds brilliant. Yeah.
So feel welcome anytime you like, and I myself invite you to another lunch whenever we happen to be in the same city.
Oh, that would be amazing. Thank you. I'd love to come. When all this COVID stuff settles, then maybe we can arrange something.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Thank you, Kристи, for being with us today. Thank you for your book. Again, I'm showing you here, this is your Bulgarian cover.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you very soon again.
You're welcome. Bye.